parish orphans and retrogrades, the Christ is King debates rage on across the land, across the right-wing space in America. What's happening is you have a bunch of conservatives debating with one another whether or not it's okay to say that Christ is king. And by conservatives, I mean Christians. Currently, Christians are going at it because of Candace Owens leaving or being fired from Daily Wire as to whether or not Christ is king, because all Christians, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestants agree that Christ is king, of course, but they're debating whether it's okay to say it and under what circumstances it's okay to say it if it is. And there are some pundits out there that you know and many of you love who are making some really, really bad videos, bad analysis. The most recent bit of bad analysis is from good Catholic, generally respected Catholic, Trent on what the meaning of this all is. And he gave us an explanation of how Christ is king is an anti-Semitic refrain that's much more reasonable than Andrew Klavan's from Daily Wire, who is, I guess, defending Daily Wire against Candace Owens, And, of course, Trent made better points than Klavan made, but not without fault. There's a moral equivalence that Trent's going to draw, in a second I'll play a few clips from him, between anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, specifically along the lines of expulsions of Catholics and fear of Catholics in institutions and polities. And he makes this equivalent analysis to expulsion of Jews from polities and institutions, and says anybody that wants Catholics and or Jews, and has done so over the last 2,000 years, out of certain polities or certain institutions, is being equally biased and equally sinful against both. Now, I'm going to play you this clip from Trent. I invited him on. He gave a vague statement on Twitter. I also invited him on by email. I have to double check, but as of my last check, he hadn't responded to the email, and I don't think he has, but I'll let you know if he has. But listen to what he says. That I said, Trent, what you're claiming here, that it's equally wrong for anybody to want the expulsion of a Catholic or a Jew from an institution or a polity, is based on cultural relativism. If you go to Benedict XVI's document, the Regensburg Address, one of my favorite short Catholic documents of all time, very informative and very influential on me, he says there are three central moments of de-Hellenization in the West, and that this is what has essentially brought down the West. The first moment of de-Hellenization, the outstripping of Aristotle from Western culture, was the Protestant Reformation. The second moment was liberal Protestant theology, specifically in Tübingen. He's very specific here, in Germany. And the third moment is ongoing, even though the first two moments of Protestantization and de-Hellenization happen at discrete moments in time. The third moment is cultural pluralism or cultural relativism, the assertion and the presupposition that all cultures are morally the same. Remember, this is the same Benedict who said, if all values and ethics are relative, then cannibalism is just a matter of taste. And he says that the third moment of de-Hellenization in the West is marked by the fact that people, even Catholics, think Trent Horn, cannot distinguish between two cultures. Say Catholic culture in the Middle Ages, where in Northern Europe, they became Protestant and began to fear Catholics and expel them from certain countries and certain institutions. That's good culture. Catholic culture is the highest culture, true cultura. And Jewish culture, which in many of the same countries and in the same era, were being expelled from institutions and from those countries. Trent says, this is equally wrong. Tim, don't you believe in dignity? This is what he responded to me on Twitter. He said, it's not equally wrong to to punish, say, a criminal with 10 years in prison and a non-criminal for 10 years in prison. I'm not necessarily saying anyone's a criminal here. I'm just saying expulsions are sometimes due and sometimes not due. Listen to what Trent says. Here, can we, actually, how do I turn this up here? Sorry about it. Let me re-get it. Which, is this the Bluetooth? I'm sorry, people. I'm so very sorry. I think this should be it.
Christ is king. This is not a bad phrase. I've used it myself several times to communicate the truth that society is not immune to God's commands. So society, any country, can't defend things like legal abortion by an appeal to separation of church and state. Christ is king over all. But that does not mean every single use of the phrase Christ is king is good. Some people who use this phrase are taking the Lord's name in vain, or they're using Christianity as a prop to promote their own sinful behavior. One example would be Andrew Tate,
I'll just stop there. Christ is king by definition. To announce the social kingship of Christ can never be a use in vain. You might say intent specifies form, as Thomas says, and someone might say this non-vainly, this expression that is the best use of Christ's name to announce the social kingship of Christ, or one of the best. It's like saying Christ is God. Well, Christ is king is one of the best. Now, they might have a bad intent, but that's still not saying Christ's name in vain. This is the perfect usage of his name.
A Muslim who is admitted to pimping women out and is being charged with rape and sex trafficking by the Romanian government. He writes, "As a Muslim, it warms my heart to see the resurgence of spirited Christian declarations. Christ is king. And I pray Christianity regains its strength and protects its societies against the pervasive and constant erosion of morality by the devotees of Satan. If you accept everything, you stand for nothing." This is a bunch of self-serving garbage. And my favorite reply...
No, I don't think that that's self-serving garbage. There is an interesting rapport born between the three Abrahamic faiths: Christianity, Jesus is God, the one true faith; Roman Catholicism, the one true faith; Islam, where if you go to the Middle East, it's reported that your Islamic guides will semi-gladly show you the spots that were relevant to the life of Jesus; and Judaism, where there are laws always being bandied about that make Christianity some level of tortious or even criminally illegal, and Christians are regularly spat on as they go to the Holy Land. The reports are, by and large, for many, many, many years through many generations, that the treatment of Christians in the Holy Land is far superior from Muslims than Jews. And so for a Muslim who has a tortured relationship with Jesus because he rejects him as the Savior, to say, well, I'm happy that Jesus is being revered rather than regarded Talmudically, which is like the lowest view of Jesus is that in the Talmud and by those Jews who are spitting on Christians in the Holy Land, the lowest view imaginable. It's one. I don't think it's still self-serving, or I don't think it's still taking his name in vain, even for Andrew Tate, who I'm not a fan of. I've done more than any real Christian on recent record to push back against Andrew Tate, particularly in the places where he's relevant, in the red pill and intersexual rapport between men and women. I don't think he's wrong here. And I don't think he's being self-serving. I believe he's sincere. He's written on this before. I'd love to. He's a former Christian, which makes him an apostate, who became a Muslim because he said, I just would love to see Christians pushing back more. I left because they weren't. I think he's being sincere. I sincerely believe he's being sincere, and I am no Tate fan. Listen to this next one.
God or Lord, right? So there's nothing wrong with the phrase Allahu Akbar, because Arabic Christians use this phrase to say God is great. The problem is that some Muslims have co-opted the phrase for sinful purposes, like terrorism. They'll exclaim Allahu Akbar before committing an act of terror. So if a certain group of people who downplay, mock, or even endorse the sin of terrorism like to use the phrase Allahu Akbar, then that needs to be called out, even though there's nothing wrong with saying God is great in Arabic. Likewise, if groups of people who downplay, mock, or even endorse the sin of anti-Semitism use the phrase Christ is king, then that too needs to be called out, even though there's nothing wrong with saying Christ is king. Now, almost everyone agrees anti-Semitism is sinful. They just disagree on what counts as anti-Semitism. For example, nearly everyone agrees that hating people because of their genetics and trying to exterminate them is evil. But critics who are accused of anti-Semitism often say they don't do that, or they're not arguing for that, so they are not guilty of the sin of anti-Semitism. However, there's more to anti-Semitism than just the most extreme examples. Now, I want to be clear that not every charge for simply coercion to the dehumanization of Jewish people. What is the true?
Okay, I want to make a quick remark there. He literally is holding out his crimes or sins and holding them in the scales at relatively similar places without explicitly saying they're occupying similar depths of seriousness in the scales. But he's comparing them, yelling out Allahu Akbar as one commits an act of mass murder. That's the Islamic version. And countervailing on the other side of the scale, a Catholic who says Christ is king, and they're both proclaiming the good name of God. And he says Christ is king in a way that is, let's say, contestant. And Andrew Klavan, just to go back to his take on the whole Candace Owens situation, said that, or actually Jeremy Boring on the Andrew Klavan situation, Andrew Klavan seems to agree, says there's denotation and connotation. Denotation means what the phrase means. Connotation means what it means plus all of its attendant emotions that it's expected to produce. Well, they're two very different things with regard to Christ as king. Saying Christ as king is good for Christians in this value-neutral secular society that Daily Wire seems to operate out of. But if you say it to a Jew, if you say Christ is king to a Jew, then you're kind of poking him in the eye, and it's not a good thing. Remember, I would say it's actually not much of a distinction between the denotation and the connotation of saying Christ is king simpliciter and announcing it to a Jew. Why? Because Jesus, A, he grew out of the Jewish tradition. He was a Jew. B, the headboard, which said Jesus is the king of the Jews, was a mocking expression of the Romans, of both Jesus and the Jews. And C, because the Jews so regularly have taken it upon themselves to take umbrage at this expression that doesn't otherwise designate them. So the question is there a denotative or connotative designation of Judaism by the expression Christ is king? A lot of Christians who are timid about this would say no. I would say yeah. Yeah, there is. Christ grew out of the Jewish tradition. He said that I'm the culmination of the religion. In other words, those who continue to observe this religion are wrong. They're wrong because literally, as John's gospel proclaims, it is Pharisaic Jews who had the Babylonian Talmud, and that's why Jesus hated them. Jesus hated the Pharisees because they had the Babylonian Talmud, unlike the Sadducees. And they put him to death because he represented the answer to the law, the Torah, and because he did not fit the categories of the Talmud. And the Talmud, of course, says things horrible that I don't even want to repeat about boiling in excrement. I won't repeat the full sentence. So I would boldly say, yeah, both connotatively and even in its stripped bare denotation, Christ is king always bears a sort of secondary referent to the Jews. And anytime you say it as a Christian, it means we Christians acknowledge that our faith grew out of a failed one. Now, not a wholly failed one, because we still have the Old Testament, but one that failed because of the Babylonian Talmud, because of the blind spots, which made most, not all, of the Jews 2,000 years ago blind, have changed blindness to the fact that their religion had just been ended from Judaism to Christianity. The true religion became Christianity. And they were unable to see that because of the Talmud. So Christ is king is not a crime to announce in a contestant spirit with a little bit of a wink and a little bit of a any indicia of contest with regard to the Jews, who explicitly, according to John's gospel, had a very direct role, agency role in the killing of Jesus 2,000 years ago, and who today make jokes like, hands up, don't nail